Well, as those talks that we've been talking about take place in Saudi Arabia between Russia and the U.S., President Zelensky has said that he believes that the Trump administration is after a quick win with the Russians, but he said he didn't regard it as a simple ceasefire as any victory. Meanwhile, European leaders met in Paris on Monday to discuss concerns about the Trump administration's decision to initiate the talks without their involvement, and Sakir Stama has said that he is ready to send UK forces if there is any peace deal. Let us talk more about this with our correspondents in K.E. James Waterhouse in Paris, Andrew Harding, and at Westminster is Hannah Miller. If I could start off with you, James, how are these talks going? Down in Ukraine, well, there are criticisms in these parts of Europe, over Europe, not being able to kind of up where America has challenged it. It's, people really do feel that they've been afraid of Russia to this point, which is why it is playing catch-up. As for President Zelensky, he's described America as trying to please the Kremlin, in trying to get a quick peace deal, as Donald Trump has said he has wanted for some time now. And I think the worry here is what that win would be for Washington, what that deal might look like, because at the moment behind closed doors in Riyadh, you have discussions that will shape Ukraine's future, potentially, and despite American assurances that Ukraine will be involved in this process, the key outcome seems to be a subsequent summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So where does President Zelensky factor into this, and what would he be entering into? Where Russia, we've heard its maximalist demands going into its meeting. What is Marco Rubio going to say to Sergei Lavrov to counter his demands? What concessions will he try to convince Russia to make? Because all we've heard is what Ukraine is going to have to give up in terms of territory, in terms of NATO ambitions. And so it boils down to this for President Zelensky. He is saying, we're not going to agree to anything without us being there, and we're not going to engage with Russia until there is a clear plan in place now. It is one thing to say that, but if America hammers down an agreement primarily focusing on Russia's interests, it leaves Ukraine with a very difficult choice. I think there will always be the desire to fight. There will always be the desire to get the peace that it wants, but if America becomes increasingly disinterested and increasingly favors Moscow in terms of how it would bring this ceasefire to an end, then it could be very messy and uncertain for Ukraine. This isn't by any means an end that people want, despite those yearnings for peace. Andrew Harding in Paris, you were monitoring that European leaders meeting. Yesterday, they seemed to be split on whether to deploy peacekeepers in the event of any ceasefire. Exactly. The British came in saying we potentially could offer peacekeepers for any ceasefire deal to patrol those front lines. France has said nothing on that. Other European nations came out with much more cautious messages, basically saying it is much too early to talk about that. I think there is a general sense in Europe that things need to slow down. The Americans may be pushing ahead with their rhetoric, with their plans, their meetings, but I think there's a general understanding that these talks are going to be very slow, very difficult, and Europe doesn't want to get boxed into offering troops to support a deal that they don't think is going to be a lasting one. And very pointedly last night, Emmanuel Macron, in very brief comments after the meeting, after which he said he'd spoken to Donald Trump and to Vladimir Zelensky, he said, "We don't want this to go back to a repeat of the Minsk agreement, which you may remember back in 2014. This was an agreement between Russia and European nations and Ukraine to try and stabilize and stop the fighting in the east of the country after Russia's first invasion, after it first took Crimea and a chunk of the DBAS. That agreement, that Minsk agreement, was ultimately a disaster. It allowed Russia to buy time, and of course it led to the subsequent invasion. And there's a concern, a deep concern in Europe that the Trump administration, by seeming to want to rush into a quick deal with Putin, might be leading Europe towards another stalled, paused, frozen conflict which could lead to a renewal of the war in months or years to come. And Hannah Miller, our political correspondent at Westminster, we mentioned that Sakir Saint said he's ready to send British troops, but he said also that any deal would need a U.S. backstop. Do we know what that U.S. backstop would be? He was asked about that, and he was keen to avoid spelling it out. But allies of Keir Starmer have suggested it's likely to mean things like air support. Support with logistics and also intelligence capabilities from the U.S., essentially the things that the UK doesn't have in the quantities required it feels in order for peace to be maintained, if it can be achieved in the first place. Keir Starmer has said, as you've mentioned, that he would be prepared to put British troops on the ground. Alongside other countries, I think that is a key part of this, and only to ensure a lasting peace, and I think we have to see that in some ways as a way of demonstrating commitment to the U.S., as he tries to kind of bridge this divide between the U.S. and Europe in a way of essentially kind of saying, look, we really are committed to this, we're prepared to do this, we need to see this from the U.S. as well. There are those in the U.K. who question the extent to which it will be possible for the British to put significant numbers of troops on the ground given the situation that the armed forces are in. But there does seem generally to be public support for that kind of move, as long as it is alongside other countries as part of a kind of peacekeeping type of effort, a YouGov survey yesterday suggested that just over half of people are in favor of that kind of idea, only around 20%, 1 in 5 would be against it. But I think for Keir Starmer demonstrating that commitment and having the personnel to put in place and keeping people on side at a time when money is tight as well, and there are questions around defense funding, and whether that comes at the cost of other public services, are all questions that he's going to have to navigate as he tries to bridge what he sees as the divide between Europe and the U.S. Hannah Miller at Westminster and Andrew Harding in Paris, and our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse, who in Kyiv. Thank you very much indeed. And a reminder that we have a live page running on the BBC News website and out with the very latest developments on those talks that are taking place in Saudi. Do stay with us here on UKK News.